The hills of ancient Canaan still hum with forgotten footsteps, the kind of footsteps pressed quietly into the earth long after kingdoms have crumbled, long after swords have rusted, long after the names of giants have faded from the lips of the proud. But some stories, some names, never fade. Tonight, we wander into one of the oldest underdog stories the world has ever known. The boy with the sling, the warrior with the sword, the battlefield trembling between them. David and Goliath. A quiet story of courage, of defiance, of faith towering taller than fear, unfolding softly across the hills and valleys of a land older than memory itself. But before we begin, I wonder, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Is it early morning where the sun is just waking? Or deep into the night when the world feels still and ancient stories draw close? Let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories stretch across time and space. Now, let's drift gently into the story of David, the shepherd, the son, the underdog the giants never saw coming. The hills of Bethlehem rise quietly, their slopes soft with olive trees, their edges worn by the gentle press of sheep's feet and the familiar footsteps of shepherds who know the rhythms of the land. Among these hills, where the wind drifts slowly through the grass and the sun leans low in the sky, a boy named David walked, not yet a warrior, not yet a king, but simply the youngest of Jesse's sons, his hands calloused from the shepherd's staff, his heart steady in the silence of the pasture. David was not the one others would notice first. He was not the tallest, nor the strongest, nor the one whose name was called when great things needed doing. He was the youngest, the brother often left behind when the older sons went to war, the boy whose hands smelled of wool and cedar, whose days were measured by the quiet company of sheep, by the patient learning of the sky, the earth, the pulse of the fields. And yet, the sacred often moves through the unnoticed. God's gaze lingers not on the proud shoulders of the tallest, but upon the heart that beats quietly in the fields, the heart that sings to the hills when no one is listening, the heart that stands steady when no one is watching. David's songs rose to the sky long before the crowd knew his name. His voice drifted among the sheep, his melodies carved softly into the stones, his worship pressed into the silence of the hills. Jesse, his father, loved him as any father does, but even Jesse did not imagine greatness resting upon the shoulders of his youngest. The older sons, strong, tall, battle-ready, these were the ones Jesse thought worthy of the prophet's attention. When Samuel, the prophet of God, arrived in Bethlehem, carrying with him the quiet weight of divine instruction to anoint a new king, Jesse lined up his sons, the ones he was sure would be chosen. The firstborn, Eliab, stood tall, broad-shouldered, commanding, his appearance enough to impress any onlooker. But the sacred voice within Samuel whispered, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." One by one, Jesse's sons passed before Samuel, each one strong, each one expected, yet the divine silence remained. "Are these all the sons you have?" Samuel asked, his voice pressing gently against the edges of Jesse's understanding. Jesse's answer was almost an afterthought. "There is still the youngest," he said. "He is tending the sheep." And so they sent for him, the boy in the field, the shepherd whose days had been counted by quiet faithfulness, the one who worshipped with no audience but the sky. When David arrived, the sacred voice moved within Samuel's spirit, firm and sure. "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." The oil dripped softly down David's head, the sacred anointing pressing upon a boy whose hands still carried the scent of the pasture, whose shoulders still bore the dust of the hills, whose eyes had not yet glimpsed the battlefield, waiting beyond the quiet fields of Bethlehem. David was chosen, not because he was the strongest nor the most obvious, but because his heart belonged to the Lord long before the world ever saw him. And still, David returned to the fields. Though anointed, he was not yet crowned. Though called, he was not yet sent. His days unfolded in the familiar rhythm of tending sheep, guarding the flock, standing quietly against the dangers that crept near in the stillness of the night. It was in those fields that David learned to fight, not with the sword of an army, but with the sling and the staff of a shepherd. When lions came, he did not run. When bears pressed close, he stood steady. The courage that would one day face a giant was forged not beneath the roar of crowds, but in the silent places where faith is tested beneath the open sky. And so David waited, not passively, but faithfully. He waited in the rhythm of the hills, in the breath of the wind, in the sacred quiet where courage grows in the absence of applause. The day would come when the army of Israel would tremble before a giant. The day would come when brothers who had once looked down upon their youngest sibling would stand in disbelief as David stepped forward. But for now, David remained in the pasture, his songs rising softly to the heavens, his hands steady upon the sling, his heart already known by God. The story of David and Goliath does not begin upon the battlefield. It begins here, in the fields of Bethlehem, in the silence of the hills, in the unnoticed faithfulness of a boy who would one day face a giant not with pride, but with the quiet, steady courage that grows when one walks close to the heart of the Lord. The sun burned gently over the hills of Judah, the earth stretching wide beneath the hum of crickets and the quiet rustle of olive branches swaying against the afternoon breeze. And somewhere along those worn trails that folded through Bethlehem's edge, David moved with the familiar rhythm of a shepherd, the dust pressed against his sandals, the sling resting at his side, his eyes drawn always to the flock entrusted to him, each sheep known, each quiet bleat met with steady care, his days shaped not by glory, but by the ordinary defiance of faithfulness unseen by the world. And it was there, along those quiet hillsides, that courage formed, not in the echo of applause or the gathering of armies, but in the silent vigilance of one who guarded the vulnerable from the shadows that crept near. The lions came, their paws pressed silent upon the earth, their hunger bending toward the flock, and David stood, not with sword or shield, but with the resolve of one who understood that courage blooms not when the world watches, but when no one else will stand. The bears came too, their breath heavy in the dark, their claws carving fear into the edges of the night. Yet David's hands did not falter, his sling whirling through the hush of twilight, his stones sent swift as the prayers whispered beneath the stars. And in these quiet victories, long before the roar of battlefields and the trembling of nations, David learned the weight of trust, the knowledge that strength was not measured by stature, but by the heart anchored beyond fear, beyond pride, beyond the limitations others see. Yet while David's hands pressed steady to the work before him, far beyond the hills of Bethlehem, another story was unfolding, a storm gathering along the valley of Elah, where the armies of Israel stood paralyzed beneath the shadow of a giant whose presence fractured even the bravest spirits, his name whispered with dread, his armor gleaming like iron mountains beneath the sun, Goliath of Gath, champion of the Philistines, warrior of defiance, his voice stretching across the valley like a storm made of pride and mockery, his challenge carved into the air each morning and evening. Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. Day after day, Goliath's taunts unraveled across the battlefield, his height towering beyond reason, his armor heavy as iron gates, his words bending the courage of Israel's finest into trembling silence. And no one stepped forward, not Saul, king of Israel, nor the seasoned warriors whose shoulders bore the weight of battle, for fear wrapped tight around their hearts, and the size of the giant cast shadows larger than their faith could hold. Yet while armies faltered, David's days remained rooted in the fields, his worship rising in quiet defiance of the storms gathering beyond the hills, his hands steady upon the sling, his songs carving faith into the edges of the pasture, unaware that soon his path would bend beyond the flock, beyond the hills, beyond the ordinary rhythm of his quiet life, and lead him straight to the valley where the world waited, breath held, to see whether courage could truly stand against the impossible. The morning sun drifted gently across the hills of Bethlehem, the grass bending beneath the soft weight of dew, the sheep grazing quietly along the familiar slopes, their presence as steady as the breath of the earth itself, and David, with his staff in hand and the sling resting at his side, moved through the pasture as he always had, his eyes trained upon the flock, his heart anchored in the sacred rhythms of faithfulness, unaware that this ordinary dawn would unfold into a day carved by destiny. For beyond the hills, beyond the olive groves and distant fields, Jesse, David's father, stood watching the horizon, his face pressed with quiet concern. For 3 of his eldest sons, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, had been called to the battlefield, their shoulders burdened by the weight of war, their voices lost among the trembling thousands gathered in the valley of Elah, where Israel's army stood fractured by fear, their spirits worn thin beneath the taunts of the giant who defied them day after day. And so Jesse, weary with waiting, called for his youngest, the shepherd of the family, the overlooked boy whose anointing remained hidden beneath the dust of the fields, and with arms laden with bread and cheese for his brothers. David set out, not as a warrior, but as a servant, his footsteps pressing softly across the roads winding toward the valley where giants roamed and courage faltered. The journey curved through familiar trails, the scent of olive trees drifting across the breeze, the hum of the earth steady beneath his feet. And yet, with each step, the hum of distant voices grew louder, the clash of metal, the sharp cries of soldiers, the trembling breath of a nation caught in the grip of fear. As David approached the camp, his eyes stretched wide upon the valley below, where the armies of Israel stood frozen along one ridge and the Philistine ranks pressed strong upon the other, the valley yawning wide between them like a battlefield awaiting to devour hope. And there, impossibly tall, impossibly armored, stood Goliath of Gath, his frame towering like a mountain of iron, his voice booming across the valley with defiance sharpened by pride, his taunts fracturing the silence as he dared Israel to send a champion, dared them to stand, dared them to believe that faith could defeat a giant. David's heart stirred, not with fear, but with the quiet defiance forged upon the hills where lions prowled and bears pressed close. For the boy who had faced the shadows of the pasture knew that courage was not measured by height or sword, but by the heart that stands steady when no one else will. And as he moved among the camp, questions pressed upon his spirit. Why did no one stand? Why did Israel's finest falter? Why did the army of the living God remain silent while the enemy's voice roared unchecked across the valley? Whispers of his questions reached his brothers, and Eliab, David's eldest, turned with scorn etched across his face, his voice sharp with dismissal, as he accused David of pride, of foolishness, of abandoning the sheep for spectacle. But David's heart did not waver, for the courage pressed into him in the silent fields would not be silenced by ridicule. And when Saul, the king trembling upon his throne, heard of the boy's questions, he sent for him, expecting a warrior, but finding instead the youngest son, the shepherd, the overlooked, the one whose strength was hidden not in stature but in faith. And there, in the quiet space between the battlefield and the fearful king, David spoke, not with arrogance, but with the steady resolve of one who had faced impossible odds beneath the gaze of the unseen God. His words layered with defiance not of pride, but of unwavering belief. For though the world saw a boy, the heart of heaven had already declared a warrior hidden within. And David's journey, once shaped by pastures and song, now bent toward the valley of giants, where the impossible stood waiting, and courage would rise. The air along the valley of Elah hung thick with tension. The ground pressed beneath the weight of armies waiting, watching, paralyzed beneath the towering shadow of the giant, whose voice fractured courage like brittle stone. And amid the steel and fear, David stood before Saul, the king's gaze heavy with disbelief, as his eyes drifted over the boy, who dared to suggest what seasoned warriors could not. His frame small, his shoulders lean from years among sheep, his hands calloused not from swordplay, but from the quiet defiance of faithfulness in the fields. And yet, when David spoke, his voice did not tremble, for it carried with it the steady hum of one who had learned that courage is not born upon the battlefield, but in the unnoticed spaces where fear is met with quiet resolve. David told of lions, of bears, of nights beneath the open sky when danger prowled and no one but God saw him stand. And with every word, the invisible weight of his anointing pressed into the room, the sacred whisper that long before giants roamed the battlefield, heaven had already chosen this shepherd's heart for greater things. Saul, weary, uncertain, yet desperate for hope, clothed David in his own armor, the bronze heavy across the boy's frame, the sword unwieldy in hands shaped more for staff and sling than for steel. And though the gesture carried good intention, David knew the weight of pretending to be someone he was not would crush him faster than any giant. So he stripped the armor away, standing small, vulnerable, unadorned, yet anchored by the quiet defiance of a soul that had faced shadows long before the world watched. With only his staff in hand and 5 smooth stones chosen from the brook, David moved toward the valley, the ground humming with the footsteps of one whose faith pressed louder than fear, whose confidence was carved not in muscle, but in the steady, unseen strength of walking close to the heart of the Lord. As he approached, Goliath's form loomed impossibly large, the giant's frame a mountain of muscle and armor, his voice dripping with scorn as he laughed at the shepherd boy daring to cross the space between them, his taunts sharp with mockery, his pride bending tall beneath the assumption that size alone defines victory. But David's eyes did not flinch, his spirit did not falter, for while the world saw only height and weaponry, David saw the arrogance of one who defied the living God. And with the valley stretched wide, the armies frozen upon their ridges, the sun heavy above them, David spoke, not with fear, but with the quiet, unwavering strength of one who knew that giants fall not by sword alone, but by the hand of heaven steadying the smallest among us. His words cut through the air, declaring the battle was not his, but the Lord's, that this day The impossible would yield not to pride, but to purpose, not to power, but to the quiet defiance of faith unwavering. And as the sling whirled through the silence, the stone finding its mark, the giant stumbled, fell, fractured beneath the sacred audacity of a shepherd's courage, the valley holding its breath as David stood victorious, not as the strongest, not as the tallest, but as the one whose heart belonged wholly to God, reminding the world that underdogs are not defined by size, but by the sacred whisper of courage pressed deep into the soul, long before the world ever dares to look their way. The valley fell silent as the great giant's form crumbled to the earth, the ground trembling beneath the impossible collapse, the clash of iron and the heavy weight of arrogance scattering like ash upon the battlefield. And for a moment the armies stood still, breath held, eyes wide, watching as the smallest among them, David, the shepherd, the overlooked, the youngest, moved with quiet defiance toward the fallen warrior whose name had stirred fear like wildfire across the land. The sling hung at David's side, the stone having carved its mark with divine precision. But the victory was not yet complete, for the symbols of defiance, the sword, the armor, the towering figure of Goliath, still pressed upon the hearts of those who doubted that giants truly fall. So David, unflinching, stepped across the valley floor, his feet light upon the soil that had moments ago belonged to fear alone, his eyes steady upon the giant whose mockery had echoed too long across Israel's trembling ranks, and with hands calloused from the quiet labor of tending sheep, he drew Goliath's own sword. The weapon crafted for destruction now yielded to the hand of the one no one expected, and with one final act, the head of the giant was severed from pride itself, the victory complete, the impossible bending under the steady hum of faith that dared to stand where no one else would. And in that moment, the army of Israel erupted, their fear fractured, their courage reignited, their voices lifting as they surged forward, chasing the retreating Philistines, whose pride had dissolved beneath the weight of a boy's belief. Yet even as victory rippled across the hills, David's heart remained steady, his spirit unmoved by the roar of the crowd, for he knew the battle was never his alone, but belonged to the unseen hand of the Lord who had called him long before giants ever stood in his path. Word of his triumph spread quickly. The name of David whispered through the ranks, his courage etched into the breathless awe of soldiers who had faltered before the shadow of Goliath's form, but now stood renewed beneath the reminder that strength is not always measured by height, nor courage by the weight of armor, but by the quiet resilience of a heart tethered to the sacred. And so David returned, not to the quiet hills of Bethlehem just yet, but into the gaze of a king, Saul, whose eyes pressed heavy with curiosity, with unease, for though the boy stood small in stature, the echo of his victory stretched farther than the valley itself, shaking the fragile ground upon which Saul's fading authority stood. David carried with him the giant's head, the proof of what the world had doubted, the impossible made visible. Yet even now, his spirit bore no pride, only the quiet, steady hum of one who understood that faith is not a single moment upon the battlefield, but a thread woven long before, through every unnoticed act of obedience, through every song lifted into the hills when no one watched, through every trembling step taken in the face of shadows that whispered fear. The underdog had risen, not upon the strength of his own hand alone, but upon the sacred defiance of belief, the unwavering resolve of one who knew that when giants fall, it is not by accident, but by the steady unfolding of a story written long before the world dares to believe in the power of the small, the young, the underestimated, And though the echoes of victory hummed loud across the land, David's journey was only just beginning. The valley fell silent as the great giant's form crumbled to the earth, the ground trembling beneath the impossible collapse, the clash of iron and the heavy weight of arrogance scattering like ash upon the battlefield. And for a moment the army stood still, breath held, eyes wide, watching as the smallest among them, David, the shepherd, the overlooked, the youngest, moved with quiet defiance toward the fallen warrior whose name had stirred fear like wildfire across the land. The sling hung at David's side, the stone having carved its mark with divine precision. But the victory was not yet complete, for the symbols of defiance, the sword, the armor, the towering figure of Goliath, still pressed upon the hearts of those who doubted that giants truly fall. So David, unflinching, stepped across the valley floor, his feet light upon the soil that had moments ago belonged to fear alone, his eyes steady upon the giant whose mockery had echoed too long across Israel's trembling ranks. And with hands calloused from the quiet labor of tending sheep, he drew Goliath's own sword. The weapon crafted for destruction now yielded to the hand of the one no one expected, and with one final act, the head of the giant was severed from pride itself, the victory complete, the impossible bending under the steady hum of faith that dared to stand where no one else would. And in that moment, the army of Israel erupted, their fear fractured, their courage reignited, their voices lifting as they surged forward, chasing the retreating Philistines whose pride had dissolved beneath the weight of a boy's belief. Yet even as victory rippled across the hills, David's heart remained steady, his spirit unmoved by the roar of the crowd, for he knew the battle was never his alone, but belonged to the unseen hand of the Lord, who had called him long before giants ever stood in his path. Word of his triumph spread quickly, the name of David whispered through the ranks, his courage etched into the breathless awe of soldiers who had faltered before the shadow of Goliath's form, but now stood renewed beneath the reminder that strength is not always measured by height, nor courage by the weight of armor, but by the quiet resilience of a heart tethered to the sacred. And so David returned, not to the quiet hills of Bethlehem just yet, but into the gaze of a king, Saul, whose eyes pressed heavy with curiosity, with unease. For though the boy stood small in stature, the echo of his victory stretched farther than the valley itself, shaking the fragile ground upon which Saul's fading authority stood. David carried with him the giant's head, the proof of what the world had doubted, the impossible made visible. Yet even now, his spirit bore no pride, only the quiet, steady hum of one who understood that faith is not a single moment upon the battlefield, but a thread woven long before, through every unnoticed act of obedience, through every song lifted into the hills when no one watched, through every trembling step taken in the face of shadows that whispered fear. The underdog had risen, not upon the strength of his own hand alone, but upon the sacred defiance of belief, the unwavering resolve of one who knew that when giants fall, it is not by accident, but by the steady unfolding of a story written long before the world dares to believe in the power of the small, the young, the underestimated. And though the echoes of victory hummed loud across the land, David's journey was only just beginning. The halls of Saul's palace hummed with the quiet unease that often follows victory, the lingering tension pressed between gratitude and suspicion, between the celebration of a nation delivered and the fragile pride of a king whose authority now trembled beneath the rise of the unexpected. For though the people sang David's name, though the songs of triumph drifted through the streets like incense of hope, the shadows within Saul deepened, his heart bending beneath the weight of envy, his spirit unraveling in the presence of the boy who once carried only a sling and a shepherd's staff, but now carried the favor of heaven and the eyes of the people. And in the midst of this unfolding storm, David serves still, his harp in hand, his songs drifting soft across the troubled spirit of the king, his melodies steadying the fractures of Saul's mind, his presence both remedy and reminder that greatness often rises quietly from the overlooked, that courage often blooms in the shadows before the world dares to notice. Yet as David's songs carved peace across the king's restless soul, the undercurrent of resentment only grew, for Saul's eyes saw not only the shepherd boy, but the symbol of his own fading influence, the quiet echo of a future where the crown might slip beyond his grasp into the hands of one anointed by the very God he feared had turned away. And so the tension twisted tighter, the walls of the palace bending beneath whispers of jealousy, the sharp glint of a spear never far from Saul's trembling hand. For envy, when left unchecked, often sharpens into dangerous edges, and Saul's heart, pressed beneath the weight of his unraveling authority, could no longer bear the presence of David without trembling. Yet even as the king's wrath simmered, as the storms of suspicion gathered heavy upon the horizon, David's spirit remained anchored, not in pride nor in ambition, but in the sacred patience learned upon the hills of Bethlehem, where giants were felled not by stature, but by faith, where courage was forged not beneath applause, but in the silent defiance of trust unwavering. And in this season of rising favor and quiet rejection, David's soul learned again that the greatest battles are not always upon the fields of giants, but within the hearts of men, where envy gnaws, where fear festers, where the fragile dance between calling and humility unfolds slow, sacred, steady. Saul's rage would sharpen, his jealousy twisting into exile, his hand reaching for the spear that would silence the shepherd. Turned hero, yet David, though small in stature, though young in years, carried within him the same quiet defiance that stood steady in the valley of Elah, the unshaken belief that destiny does not fracture beneath the weight of opposition, that the favor of God weaves quietly through both triumph and trial. And so the underdog, though rising, remained rooted, his heart still anchored in the sacred fields of his youth, his song still lifting toward the heavens, his courage still humming steady beneath the looming storm of rejection. As the story pressed forward, the shadows deepened, and the quiet strength of a shepherd prepared to stand not only against giants, but against the unraveling of a king. The quiet halls of the palace grew heavier with each passing day. The air pressed tight beneath the weight of Saul's unraveling spirit, the whispers of the people blending with the sharp hum of envy as the name of David drifted through the shadows, not as the small shepherd boy forgotten among the fields, but as the warrior who silenced giants, the servant whose songs calmed kings, the rising one whose presence carved cracks into the fragile foundation of Saul's pride. For though David's heart remained anchored in humility, though his footsteps pressed steady in service, the storm of suspicion gathered relentless above him, dark clouds stretching across the corridors of power, and in the quiet corners of the kingdom, Saul's gaze lingered sharp with fear and jealousy, his hands restless upon the spear that would betray the trembling fractures of his authority. Yet as the king's unrest deepened, the people's love for David only grew, their voices carrying stories of the underdog who stood against the impossible, of the boy with a sling who felled a giant, of the shepherd whose courage silenced fear. And among those who watched with eyes wide and heart stirred was Jonathan, Saul's son, the prince whose birthright bound him to the crown, yet whose spirit recognized in David not a rival, but a brother, for courage often calls to courage, and the quiet defiance that blooms within the faithful draws others like a flame steady in the storm. And so it was that Jonathan's heart was knit to David's. Their bond pressed not in politics or ambition, but in the sacred thread of shared loyalty, of unwavering belief that destiny rises through the overlooked, through the underestimated, through the quiet endurance of those who refuse to fracture beneath fear. They made a covenant, their spirits aligned, their friendship carved from trust, from sacrifice, from the understanding that true strength is not found in position but in character, that the greatest victories unfold not only on the battlefield, but in the silent spaces where loyalty anchors the soul. Yet even as their friendship deepened, as the bond between shepherd and prince strengthened, the storm within Saul darkened, his pride gnawing at his heart, his jealousy sharpening into the dangerous hum of wrath unchecked. And though David's songs still drifted across the palace halls, though his hands still served with quiet humility, the spear soon slipped from Saul's trembling grip, its sharp edge slicing through the tension, as the king's rage struck not the boy's flesh, but the fragile illusion that power can silence purpose. For David escaped, his spirit bruised but unbroken, his footsteps pressed once more into the wilderness, where giants roam in new forms, forms of betrayal, of rejection, of exile disguised as protection. Yet David's heart did not yield, for the same defiance that carried him to face Goliath now anchored him in the quiet storm of persecution. His soul steady, his courage humming beneath the weight of uncertainty. The underdog now hunted, yet still rising, still believing, still carried by the sacred hand of the one who calls the overlooked, the underestimated, the unlikely to stand when the world forgets they ever could. The wilderness unfolded before David like an ancient song, layered in dust and uncertainty, the hills curling across the horizon in waves of rock and dry earth, the shadows stretching long across forgotten trails, and with every step pressed into the soil, David carried not only the weight of exile, but the quiet hum of purpose, untouched by rejection. For though Saul's wrath had sharpened into pursuit, though the halls of the palace no longer echoed with his songs of worship, the underdog spirit remained anchored, his courage woven steady through the thread of humility that had always carried him beyond the impossible. Alone yet not abandoned, hunted yet not defeated, David's footsteps pressed deeper into the wilderness, and with him gathered the overlooked, the unwanted, the restless souls drawn toward the flicker of leadership that refuses to fracture beneath fear. And so a company of men, outcasts, the weary, the dismissed, rose around him, their presence quiet proof that even in exile purpose calls, destiny weaves, the sacred story unfolds slow, hidden beneath the edges of rejection. And as they moved through caves and barren valleys, as the night stretched long with uncertainty, and the daylight hummed with the echo of Saul's pursuit, David's heart did not turn bitter. His spirit did not yield to resentment, for the courage carved in him beneath Bethlehem's hills, the defiance forged in the face of lions and giants, had taught him that the path to kingship does not rise without valleys, that the throne promised is refined through the storms endured. And so even as Saul hunted him, even as spears replaced words and fear pressed close, David's resolve sharpened, his trust deepened, his songs carved softer into the silence of exile, their melodies drifting toward the heavens, reminders that deliverance is often born not upon battlefields alone, but within the quiet defiance of endurance. And the hills of Engedi rose before him, their caves hollowed into the rock, their shadows offering shelter from the storm unraveling behind him. And it was there, hidden among the stones, that the impossible moment bent upon David's story again. For Saul entered unaware, the king vulnerable, the hunter exposed, the one who sought David's life now within reach of the very hand he had driven into exile. Yet David's courage was not forged in vengeance, his leadership not crafted by pride. And though his men urged him to strike, to seize the crown through retaliation, David's heart remembered. The Lord who anointed also appoints, and destiny taken by force fractures beneath its own weight. So with steady hand, David crept forward, his knife slicing only the corner of Saul's robe. A quiet defiance of harm, a bold whisper of restraint. And when Saul departed, unaware, David's voice called out across the valley, not in rage, but in reverence, his words layered with the strength of mercy, his posture bent in humility, his heart steady in the face of the king who hunted him. Saul's eyes widened, his spirit fractured for a moment beneath the echo of David's integrity, his pride silenced by the realization that though the underdog was hunted, his heart stood taller than the throne Saul clutched. And though the storm of pursuit would rise again, though the valley of rejection would stretch farther still, David's courage hummed steady, the quiet defiance of a shepherd's soul unwavering, his spirit anchored in the unseen hand of the one who lifts the unlikely, who weaves the underestimated into the fabric of history, who calls the overlooked to stand tall when the world forgets they ever could. The wilderness stretched farther still, its ridges worn by wind and time, its caves hollowed into the ancient bones of the earth like quiet witnesses to the unraveling storm that trailed behind David. And though the valleys whispered of exile, though the hills carried the echo of Saul's relentless pursuit, the underdog spirit remained steady, his courage humming not with the fire of vengeance, but with the quiet defiance of one who understands that destiny bends not beneath the hand of pride, but unfolds in the sacred rhythm of patience. For even as Saul hunted, even as the spear's shadow lingered upon every stone, David's heart pressed forward, not in bitterness, not in rebellion, but in unwavering belief that the same hand who called him from the pastures would raise him in the proper time. And as the seasons turned, as the years of hiding and hardship wove themselves into the fabric of his story, David's resolve did not fracture, his songs did not falter, his spirit did not yield to the temptation of shortcuts or prideful ambition, for the lessons of the field had carved into him a defiance shaped by faith. The same quiet strength that once steadied his hand against lions, against bears, against giants, now steadied his heart against rejection, against betrayal, against the exhausting weight of waiting. And it was in these unseen spaces, amid the shadows of caves, beneath the open skies of barren wilderness, that David's kingship was forged, not yet upon a throne, but within the hidden places where obedience is refined and pride is stripped away. For the underdog's rise was never a spectacle born overnight, but a slow, sacred unfolding, a journey marked by humility, by reverence, by the quiet resistance to become something other than what the hand of heaven had shaped him to be. And though the day would come when Saul's reign unraveled completely, when the weight of his jealousy fractured beneath his own undoing, David did not hasten that collapse by his own hand, for he understood the delicate thread between calling and timing, between promise and patience, between the anointing received in youth and the authority bestowed in its proper season. And so David wandered still, the wilderness his teacher, the hills his sanctuary, the silence of exile his refining fire. And even as Saul's armies pressed closer, even as the throne lingered upon the distant horizon, David's courage hummed steady, his spirit anchored in the truth that the one who called him would not forget him. that giants fall not by might, but by faith. That underdogs rise not by force, but by the relentless unfolding of a story whispered into existence long before the world dared to believe it could be so. The hills of Judah stretched farther than they seemed, their slopes folding gently into one another, like the pages of a story still being written, their ridges shaped by time, by footsteps, by the quiet passing of years measured not by the clang of swords, but by the soft endurance of one who waits. And it was upon these hills, beneath skies heavy with silence and stars, that David wandered still, the wilderness no longer a place of exile alone, but a slow, steady proving ground, where kings are carved not by crowns, but by character, where the heart that once faced giants learns to face the far greater weight of waiting. For though the anointing poured upon him as a boy still lingered upon his spirit, though the echoes of victory in the valley of Elah whispered through the cracks of memory, David's rise remained veiled, the throne still distant, the crown pressed beyond reach, yet his courage held firm, his faith bending quiet but unbroken beneath the strain of delayed promise. For the wilderness has a way of stripping away the noise, of silencing the distractions, of revealing whether the courage forged beneath the stars is strong enough to carry the weight of destiny when the world finally looks his way. And even as Saul's pursuit dragged on, even as betrayal and loss carved new scars upon his journey, David did not fracture. His spirit anchored still to the quiet defiance of one who knows that the rise of the underdog is not measured by moments alone, but by the unwavering endurance to remain faithful when the crown is delayed, when the applause fades, when the promises of God seem distant yet still linger like embers beneath the ashes of uncertainty. And so, David led his men through barren valleys, through whispered dangers, through the hidden caves of Adullam and beyond, the overlooked gathering around him, the broken, the disillusioned, the outcasts, each soul drawn not to the promise of power, but to the steady resilience of a leader who stands when others yield, who hopes when others falter, who carries within him the quiet, sacred defiance of a shepherd's heart shaped first not by thrones, but by fields, by the weight of protecting the fragile, by the songs sung into the stillness when no one listened. And even as Saul's rage pressed closer, even as spears were thrown and armies sent forth, David's spirit hummed steady, his heart refusing to fracture beneath fear, his footsteps pressing forward upon the long, winding road of humility and trust. For though the crown was promised, though kingship lingered upon the horizon, David understood that the greatest victories unfold not in haste, but in the quiet resolve to trust that giants fall, that underdogs rise, that the hand of heaven weaves purpose through every unseen moment, every silent sacrifice, every sacred step of endurance when the world looks away. The wilderness had become a companion now, its jagged ridges and sun-bleached stones no longer strangers, but familiar markers along the long road of exile, its shadows pressing close, yet failing to extinguish the quiet fire still anchored within David. For though the fields of Bethlehem had faded into the distant memory of simpler days, though the shepherd's songs once lifted into the open sky were now woven between the weight of survival and the restless pulse of men who followed him through caves and valleys, the underdog spirit hummed steady, his heart refusing to fracture beneath the storm of uncertainty. For David had learned that destiny unfolds not only upon battlefields or beneath crowns, but within the unseen moments where patience stretches thin, where promises feel distant, where the soul is tested by rejection's echo. And so he led those gathered around him, the disillusioned, the weary, the outcasts pressed from the fringes of Saul's kingdom. his company not born of politics or prestige, but of those drawn to the quiet defiance of a leader who stood unwavering even when the world forgot his name. And though their numbers swelled, though their strength grew in the shelter of the wilderness, David's heart did not rise with pride, for he knew that the same God who called him from the pastures still watched, still refined, still whispered through the hills that kingship without character fractures beneath its own weight. And as the seasons turned, as Saul's jealousy stretched longer across the land, as the throne trembled beneath the king's unraveling spirit, David's journey twisted once more toward impossible intersections, for word came that the prophet Samuel had died. The voice that once anointed him now silenced by the passing of time, and grief pressed heavy upon the land, the uncertainty of Israel deepening as the nation mourned the loss of the one who had carried the sacred mantle of heaven's whisper. Yet even in grief, even in the ache of waiting, David's resolve did not falter. His spirit steady beneath the knowledge that the wilderness, though lonely, was not void of purpose, that the rise of the unlikely often bends not upon applause, but upon endurance, upon the quiet unfolding of a heart refined in hardship. And so he pressed onward, his songs quieter now, yet no less full of faith, his footsteps weary, yet anchored, his courage humming beneath the weight of loss and the lingering tension that giants take many forms, some towering upon battlefields, others disguised as the ache of delay, as the sting of exile, as the long, quiet road of waiting for the hand of heaven to lift him when the time was right. For the underdog's rise was never a spectacle, but a slow, sacred, steady story still unfolding across the hills of a kingdom, yet to see its truest king. The wilderness, carved by wind and waiting, stretched farther still, its ridges folding into the horizon, like the quiet pages of a story not yet complete, its shadows lingering across ancient stones that carried the footprints of a shepherd rising, not upon pride or conquest, but upon the sacred defiance of patience. And as David pressed onward through barren valleys and forgotten hills, the ache of exile remained close, yet his spirit hummed steady, his courage refined not by swift victory, but by the endurance of restraint, by the quiet strength to trust that destiny unfolds upon heaven's rhythm, not the fragile impulse of human pride. And though the wilderness held him, though the crown remained distant, though the echoes of Saul's pursuit whispered still across the land, David's heart anchored deeper into the knowledge that giants are not always measured by height alone, but by the fears that press unseen, by the jealousy that sharpens in silence, by the temptation to fracture when the weight of waiting feels impossible to bear. And yet David stood steady, his resolve bending not toward vengeance, but toward the quiet confidence that the one who called him would finish what was started. Still, even the strongest hearts tremble when the path twists farther into uncertainty. And when word reached David that the Philistines once again pressed upon Israel's borders, their armies unraveling across the land, their defiance echoing through the hills, the ache to rise, to return, to stand where the anointing first whispered destiny upon his life, burned within him. Yet the crown still rested upon Saul, the kingdom still tethered to a king unraveling. And so David remained hidden, the wilderness his shelter, his spirit his only throne, his songs the quiet anthem of a heart refined in obscurity. But Saul, restless, fractured beneath fear, turned his gaze toward dangerous ground, his spirit desperate for answers the heavens refused to yield, his pride bending toward the forbidden as he sought counsel from shadows, from the witch of Endor, his heart pressing upon paths veiled in darkness, his authority trembling beneath the weight of disobedience. And though David did not yet wear the crown, though his name still drifted beneath the surface of Israel's weary hopes, destiny stirred, unseen but certain, the storms of battle pressing close, the unraveling of Saul's reign accelerating with every fearful step taken outside the will of the God who had once called him. And as the horizon stretched wide with uncertainty, as the ache of waiting pressed heavy upon his shoulders, David's courage remained anchored, his story unfolding not upon the swift current of conquest, but along the sacred, steady breath of patience. The underdog still rising, still refining, still pressing forward beneath the unseen hand of the one who weaves even exile into the quiet foundation of kings. The wilderness carried its silence heavier now, the distant echoes of battle pressing across the ridges, the rumors of armies gathering beneath foreign banners stirring the winds. And though David's feet still pressed upon barren soil, his spirit hummed with the weight of something shifting, the ache of exile folding into the sacred realization that the rise of the underdog was never meant to be swift nor simple, but carved slowly upon the fragile edge of endurance, upon the quiet defiance of a soul that refuses to fracture beneath the ache of delay. For while Saul's authority unraveled in secret, while shadows whispered of his desperation, of his wandering toward forbidden voices and full strength, the hand of heaven remained steady upon David's journey, weaving even the unseen valleys into the foundation of a kingship promised, but not yet placed upon his head. And as David and his men moved through the wilderness of Ziklag, the burdens of leadership pressed heavier, the quiet responsibility of shepherding not only sheep but now men, families, the fragile hopes of the outcast, the overlooked, the wounded, all gathering beneath the thread of David's unwavering spirit. And yet, even here, amid the quiet waiting, the trials deepened, for when they returned to Ziklag, the ashes spoke before words ever could, the smoke rising from what once was home, the Amalekites having swept through, their destruction unraveling what little peace remained, their hands tearing families apart, their fires silencing the sanctuary David's weary men had known. And in the raw ache of loss, even the most faithful hearts trembled, the men who had followed David through caves and battles now turning, their grief twisting toward blame, their voices pressing upon him with the sharp edge of stones in hand. Yet in the fragile breath between despair and collapse, David did not yield to fear, nor fracture beneath their rage, but pressed his soul deeper into the quiet foundation that had always carried him, the unseen strength of the Lord his God, the sacred refuge that never falters beneath the storms of human frailty. And as he inquired of heaven, as he lifted his trembling heart toward the only hope that never shifts, the answer came clear, unwavering. Pursue them, for you will surely overtake them and rescue what was lost. And so David, his courage reignited not by pride, but by the quiet defiance of faith restored, led his men forward, his footsteps pressed steady upon the soil, his spirit unwavering beneath the unseen hand that had always guided him beyond lions, beyond giants, beyond exile. And as they pursued the Amalekites, as they reclaimed their families, their future, their fractured hope, the story of the underdog whispered louder, that giants fall, that even the most impossible valleys bend beneath the steady unfolding of a heart refined by patience, by humility, by trust. And though the crown remained distant, though the journey twisted still, David's rise pressed onward, slow, sacred, steady, the wilderness shaping him not into a king the world expected, but into a leader heaven had always known he would become. The soil beneath David's feet carried the scars of many storms now, the earth hardened by the press of exiled footsteps, by the quiet endurance of a shepherd turned leader whose rise had never followed the smooth ascent of human expectation, but had bent always upon the sacred rhythm of patience, upon the rugged edges of wilderness and waiting. And though the ashes of Ziklag still smouldered behind him, though the ache of loss still lingered upon the hearts of those he led, David's spirit hummed steady with the quiet defiance of one who understands that true strength is not forged beneath the roar of victory alone, but within the silent resolve to rise again when the world unravels beneath your feet. And as the dust settled upon reclaimed ground, as families restored breathed life into weary camps, the news came, a whisper first, carried upon restless winds, then heavier, more certain, a report wrapped in both sorrow and the fragile hum of inevitable change. Saul, the king, the pursuer, the fractured soul, once anointed yet unraveling beneath pride and fear, had fallen upon the battlefield of Gilboa, his body broken, his reign silenced beneath the relentless tide of consequence, and with him, Jonathan, David's friend, his brother in covenant, the sacred bond carved through loyalty and sacrifice now pressed into the weight of grief deeper than words could hold. And in the hollow stillness of this moment, David did not rise with pride, did not seize the unfolding story with ambition sharpened by years of exile, but tore his garments, wept with the raw ache of one who knew that destiny without compassion fractures beneath its own weight. His songs carved now in lament, his voice trembling beneath the sacred sorrow for the fallen king, for the brother lost, for the nation fractured beneath the heavy hand of defeat. And even as others expected celebration, even as whispers stirred that the crown might now finally rest upon his brow, David's heart resisted haste, refused to twist grief into gain, and instead pressed into the same humility that had carried him through caves and shadows, through valleys of rejection and relentless storms. For though giants had fallen, though exile had refined him, David knew the weight of leadership, the fragile responsibility of kingship, carved not upon easy victories, but upon the slow, steady defiance of a heart shaped first in hidden places. And so he waited still, his spirit bending toward the quiet guidance of the God who had always known his name, the rise of the underdog pressing onward not with sudden applause, but upon the sacred unfolding of a story written long before a sling ever struck a giant, long before songs filled the streets, long before the world dared to believe that the overlooked shepherd boy might one day stand as king. The winds that drifted across the hills of Judah carried the weight of change now, their breath pressing softly through olive groves and over sun-bleached stones, their edges layered not only with the ache of loss, but with the quiet hum of something inevitable unfolding. For though the crown of Saul had fallen, though the battlefield whispered of endings and of sorrow, the story of David, the shepherd turned warrior, the underdog once hidden among the hills, pressed onward, slow, sacred, steady, the long journey of exile now bending toward the fragile beginnings of kingship. And yet, even as the people looked to him, even as voices stirred with expectation, David's spirit refused to fracture beneath pride or haste, for he knew the hand of heaven weaves destiny not through conquest alone, but through character refined in silence, through patience pressed deep into the soul when the crown feels impossibly distant. And so, when the elders of Judah came, when they anointed David king, not of all Israel, but of Hebron, of one tribe, of a beginning as quiet and small as the shepherd's staff he once carried, David did not despise the smallness of the start, nor twist the partial rise into bitterness, but stepped into leadership with the same humility that had anchored him beneath the open skies, his courage steady, not because the throne was now his, but because his heart remained tethered to the God who had carried him through every valley, every storm, every impossible crossing. And though the nation remained divided, though Saul's house still clawed to hold power, though the ache of Jonathan's absence pressed close, David's reign in Hebron became a refuge for the weary, a gathering place for the outcasts, a slow, sacred unfolding of what it means to lead not with force but with faithfulness, not with arrogance, but with the quiet defiance of a soul shaped first by rejection, by exile, by the wilderness of waiting. And as the years pressed forward, as Saul's house unraveled beneath its own pride, as grief and time carved their marks upon the nation, the moment finally arrived when all the tribes of Israel turned their eyes to David, when the elders came not only to acknowledge his strength, but to recognize his heart, the heart of a shepherd still steady beneath the crown, the heart of a warrior who knew giants fall by faith, the heart of an underdog whose story had never been about shortcuts, but about the sacred patience to let heaven's promises unfold in their proper time. And so David was anointed king over all Israel, his journey from forgotten fields to fractured nation complete not in sudden triumph, but upon the long, winding road of endurance, humility, and unwavering trust that the one who calls also sustains. And as David took the throne, as Jerusalem rose beneath his leadership, as the whispers of Bethlehem's hills echoed still in his spirit, the world was reminded that true strength is not measured by size, nor kingship by the speed of its rise, but by the quiet, unshaken defiance of a soul who believes even the smallest, even the overlooked, even the underdog, can stand when heaven calls them forward. The city of Jerusalem hummed now beneath David's feet, its stone walls pressed steady against the horizon, its ancient foundations layered with both promise and the fractures of history. And as the newly anointed king moved through its streets, his footsteps carried the quiet weight of a journey long, weathered, and shaped not by ease but by the sacred tension of waiting, of wilderness, of exile. For though the crown rested upon his brow, though the songs of the people echoed once again with his name, David's spirit hummed steady, his heart anchored not to the fleeting applause of victory, but to the enduring defiance of faith woven deep across the many valleys that had shaped him. For he understood now more than ever that leadership is not born upon thrones, but upon the slow, often unseen refining that unfolds when the world doubts you, when giants rise, when rejection presses close and promises feel distant. And though he ruled now from Zion, though the nation gathered beneath his leadership, though his victory stretched beyond the city walls into the territories of enemies subdued, David's humility did not fracture. For the songs once sung beneath Bethlehem's open sky still whispered through his soul, reminders of the shepherd who learned to stand when no one noticed, of the boy who believed when others trembled, of the underdog who defied the impossible, not with armor but with faith, not with status, but with the quiet confidence that heaven's strength is not measured by human eyes. And yet, even as Jerusalem rose, even as the Ark of the Covenant returned, even as David danced before the Lord with the joy of promises fulfilled, the story carried beneath its triumphs the ache of fragility, the quiet hum of warning that even the strongest hearts falter when pride lingers unchecked. And though David's reign was marked by victories, by the uniting of a fractured nation, by the fulfillment of words spoken long before a sling ever struck a giant, his humanity, raw and vulnerable, still pulsed beneath the weight of power. And in the years to come, his flaws, his failures, his fragile choices would press upon the edges of his story, for the rise of the underdog, though sacred, is not immune to the storms of the soul. Yet through it all, through the triumphs and the tears, the anointing remained, The promise endured. The God who called him from the pastures stood steady beside him, weaving grace and redemption into every fracture, every faltering, every quiet step forward, reminding the world again that courage is not perfection, that strength is not absence of failure, but the willingness to rise when fallen, to believe when broken, to stand still when the world doubts you most. And so David's story pressed onward, layered in both triumph and tension, a legacy etched not only in victories, but in the sacred reminder that giants fall, underdogs rise, and the heart known by heaven is never truly forgotten. The palace walls of Jerusalem held within them both the triumphs and the tremors of a story still unfolding, their stones pressed together by the hands of a nation united, yet carried always beneath the weight of human frailty. And within those walls, David, now king not only in title but in legacy, walked with the quiet ache of one who has risen beyond expectation, yet remains tethered to the same fragile breath that humbles even the greatest. For though the songs of his victories still echoed beyond the hills, though the memory of giants fallen and kingdoms secured remained stitched into the heart of Israel's story, the underdog who once stood alone upon the battlefield of Elah now stood surrounded by power, by success, by the whispers of men and the slow, dangerous hum of pride pressing beneath the cracks of his heart. And it was upon the rooftops of that same city, beneath the twilight hum of unseen temptation, that David faltered, his eyes drawn not to giants nor armies, but to the fragile, forbidden allure of Bathsheba, her presence unraveling within him a thread of desire, of pride unchecked, of a momentary fracture that would carve deep scars upon both his family and his reign. For even the strongest hearts stumble. Even the underdog anointed by heaven wrestles with shadows lingering beyond the eyes of the world. And so it was that David, driven by impulse, by power left unrestrained, summoned Bathsheba, claimed what was not his, silenced Uriah, her husband, with deception and death, the man once known for courage now tangled in failure, in the raw ache of consequences too heavy to carry. And yet, even as his sin unraveled, even as the prophet Nathan stood before him, his words layered with holy confrontation, David's spirit did not hide, did not yield to denial, but crumbled beneath the weight of repentance, his heart breaking open with the raw, trembling confession of one who remembered that strength is not the absence of mistakes, but the willingness to return, to be refined, to fall upon mercy like the only ground steady enough to stand upon. And though the consequences rippled through his household, though grief and loss pressed close, David's songs rose once more, not in pride, but in sorrow, not in victory, but in the quiet, trembling return to the one who had always known his heart. And the story of the underdog pressed forward, marred now by imperfection, yet carried still by grace, by redemption, by the steady truth that giants fall, that frailty does not fracture destiny beyond repair, that the heart surrendered, even when broken, is never forgotten by heaven. And so David led, flawed yet faithful, his crown resting not upon the illusion of perfection, but upon the quiet, sacred reminder that strength rises not from pride, but from the raw defiance of standing again after the soul has fallen. The twilight pressed softly across the hills of Jerusalem, its shadows curling along the stone streets, its breath heavy with the layered echoes of a life both victorious and flawed. And within the palace walls, beneath the weight of crown and memory, David's footsteps slowed, his years now carved into lines upon his face, his strength tempered by the long journey from Bethlehem's pastures to the throne upon which he sat. And though the songs of youth had faded, though the shadows of failure lingered across the edges of his reign, David's spirit remained tethered to the sacred thread that had carried him through every storm. The quiet, steady defiance of a heart that rises not because the world believes, but because heaven calls. For the boy who once stood in fields among sheep, who faced lions beneath open skies, who silenced a giant with nothing but a sling, an unwavering faith, was the same man who carried the scars of pride, the ache of loss, the weight of choices both righteous and fractured. And yet, through it all, his heart remained known by the one who called him, the one who weaves mercy through weakness, the one who bends even failure back toward redemption. And as David looked upon his sons, upon the city he had once wrestled to claim, upon the people whose songs still whispered of his courage and his flaws alike, he understood that legacy is not carved in perfection, but in the willingness to rise again when fallen, to trust again when fractured, to believe again when the world forgets your name. And though the giants had fallen, though the crown now rested upon his brow, David knew his truest victory was never upon battlefields alone, but in the slow, sacred unfolding of a story written not by human strength, but by the steady, unseen hand of God. And so, as his days pressed toward their twilight, as his songs softened into prayers, as the kingdom prepared to stretch beyond his reign into the promise of generations yet to come, David's heart hummed with the same defiance that once stood alone upon the valley floor. The quiet, unwavering truth that courage is not the absence of fear, that giants fall not by might but by faith, that the smallest, the overlooked, the underdog, can stand when heaven calls, and the world, despite all its doubt, cannot stop what is written by the hand of the Almighty.